Hello, and welcome to episode 86 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, I'm Nick Sautra. On today's podcast, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Sarah Robbins, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Kansas. Sarah's research is focused primarily on memory, through which she discusses a range of issues in philosophy of mind, psychology, and neuroscience. Sarah is particularly interested in the concept of the memory trace, or engram, and the role it plays in both everyday and scientific thinking about remembering. The idea that remembering involves an engram becoming stable and permanent via consolidation has guided the neuroscience of memory since its inception. The shift to thinking of memory as continuous and dynamic as part of a trend toward neural dynamics has challenged this commitment, with some calling for the demise of the fixed trace and others urging rejection of the consolidation dogma. In this regard, Sarah argues that consideration of neural dynamics does not provide reasons to reject engram theory, and in fact, they are compatible. At most, shifting to a dynamic view of neural processes compels revision of the implementational details of memory. And thus, without further ado, let's bring in Sarah. Dr. Sarah Robbins, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this Friday morning?
Well, thanks for having me. I'm great. It's nice to be here. So, yeah.
Great. How are things at the University of Kansas?
They are good. It is like the first day of fall that feels like fall here. It's the first time it's below 80 degrees, so it feels genuinely like a fall day at college. Overall, things are going very well. I think at the moment it's because people are very excited about football, which is not something people here spend time excited about. It's not really my form of excitement, but it's
collegially is right. So, but in some ways, like it creates, even if you're not into football, I imagine there's this sense of energy from the crowds and just a general sense on campus. And sometimes even if you don't like that, that can transfer into enthusiasm in classes. If the team's doing well, like people are going to be excited to show up, the undergrads and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I say this not as a anti-sports snob, but as I'm a basketball snob. And so
there it is. Oh, of course. Well, you're Kansas. So it's okay.
Kansas,
so
right.
Okay. Oh, wow. And so I was just looking, I hadn't looked at the rankings for a while. And so, yeah, you are, Kansas is a top 25 team in football, which
is for the first time in maybe 2 decades. So I figured it out officially yesterday that they've won more games so far this year. This is my 10th year at KU, than the previous 9 seasons combined. So it's a very fast. I mean, they've been building towards I'm led to understand, but so there's a lot of, and I think College game day is here, which I know about when it happens for basketball. So it is mayhem here.
Wow.
Now. I'm actually in my home office, but in part because campus is very loud today.
So the thought is, for those of you, for most of the people, I think I don't want to say they don't learn, maybe that familiar with these kinds of things. But for example, being in the top 25 in football is like an incredible accomplishment for an athletics department, considering there's thousands of universities. I'm not exactly sure. And generally speaking, it's very difficult to have multiple, revenue athletes. So football and basketball are known as revenue sports. They're athletics. So there's obviously things like soccer, track and field, things like that. There's athletics, but to have multiple revenue sports highly ranked is an extremely difficult accomplishment by a university. I also went to an undergraduate University of Arizona, where basketball was really big, and football was not good at all. Just because you could only really, And then there's school, there's programs Wisconsin or something, or maybe Ohio State. No, usually you pick one. Usually it's you're usually just good at one for the most part. But anyway, so that's that's interesting to me. And then also the college game day thing is, what is it, a national, it's every week it goes to a new venue, and they have essentially live reporting and coverage of a very big game or something like that. Yeah.
So it's a kind of incentive for everyone to be, did we break up?
No, I'm still here.
It's a big opportunity to display a lot of fandom very publicly. People are
fair enough. So it's
gearing up costume-wise, it seems like around campus. So.
Well, it looks like both teams are undefeated. Kansas, you're the Jayhawks, and there's the TCU Horned Frogs. So this would be good if Kansas can pull out a victory. They will be in the next. Anyway, wow, that's the most I've talked about sports on this podcast. I don't think I've ever, very, very, very briefly, but
it's football, which just hurts my soul. But
I'm sorry about that. Well, Kansas. No, well, I always pick Kansas in the NCAA bracket. Kansas is usually, I don't know. I'm sure in certain brackets I pick them to win. And hopefully, I'm excited. Hopefully we can see some really cool things going on for the basketball. It's going to be exciting. So we just hopped on a call right before we started this, and you mentioned you were there was a really good talk from a colleague regarding some of your on the topic with which you work, philosophy of memory. How was the talk this morning?
It was a fantastic talk. So it was David Colasso, who's currently a postdoc in Munich, and he was talking about some of his work on the history of the phenomenon of memory transfer. So it's a rich project in the in history and philosophy of science on this very controversial set of findings, where there's sort of, in part because the central scientific figure was a bit. It sort of was known for being the kind of provocateur about the work that he was doing. But it also there's really interesting questions about whether it's a viable phenomenon. This involved this is his story to tell, but taking worms and giving them memories and then seeing if you can get those memories to go forward in future, if you can transfer those memories to other
memory transfer. Right.
Yeah, exactly. So the kind of sci-fi style thing, but it looks like, for some, it's a helpful thing for a philosopher to say, in the end, half of the legitimacy of that program is what you mean by memory, right? So thinking about what exactly it means to transfer certain mechanisms and exhibit certain behaviors, those kinds of questions are really sort of fundamental ones behind the evaluation of that framework. So, so it was a really fun conversation.
Great. Well, I'm excited to hear. So, I've started to know. I've known David briefly, and then I've also, in following him, have become familiar with other philosophers of memory like yourself and others. So there's this, and have seen panels and workshops, and even beyond symposiums, working groups on philosophy of memory at the PSA, and I imagine abroad, seen positions. And so I'm really excited to hear what is this particular field, a little bit of the history of this subspecialty in philosophy of science, how it relates, how it connects with obviously related things into philosophy of mind, cognitive science, and then the sciences in general, psychology, of neuroscience, things like that. So before we get into that, why don't we take a step back and learn a little bit about you, Sarah, and your little bit about history, how you got into philosophy of science to begin with. So Sarah, tell us, where did you grow up?
I grew up actually in Kansas, where I am now. So
great.
A couple of hours from here. So it's in small, mostly in one single small town, but in small towns in this area. So it is in many ways very nice to be back here. It's also very strange to be back in this part of the world in a permanent way, which is not, when you go to graduate
coming back to visit.
Exactly. You don't really see yourself as returning someplace near where you started. So, I don't have a family with a background in higher ed in this way. And so when I was going to graduate school, a lot of them were trying to make sense of that. And they said okay, so that means you'll teach at the University of Kansas someday? And I was like, no, it doesn't work like that.
It likely means I have to move where I don't have any control over, actually. And I just have to go where it's kind of like joining the military or something. I don't know.
Right. So I told them that story. They refused to believe that was true. And then I got the job here. And so I get a lot of I told you so's that I just have to, I'm very fortunate.
I told you where you'd come back. You're like, yeah, okay. You don't understand how much luck got into this.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I feel privileged and lucky. So I take it. But yeah, it's sort of funny to me.
Cool. What was okay, so outside, so University of Kansas is located, you said you grew up about, you said a few hours away.
Mm-hmm, a few hours south of here. Yeah.
Okay.
The southeastern part of the state.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what were some of your interests growing up? What does someone in Kansas find themselves up to?
Not a lot when you live in small towns. But I had kind of, I guess, what kind of interest did I have? I mean, I love to read. I was an avid reader. So I read a bunch, especially which is still a guilty pleasure of mine, like mystery novels, like every one that's ever been written. So, so I did a lot of those kinds of things, and I played sports because that's what kids in Kansas do. And when I was younger, I was determined that I was going to be some kind of doctor. And I told people that I wanted to be a psychiatrist, which I think, given everything I knew about the world at the time, was the closest I got to understanding that I wanted to study minds and brains.
Gotcha.
So that's when I thought of what I wanted to do. It was something like that. But of course I had no idea what was it
about being a psychiatrist that was kind of motivating to you?
I think that's a good question. I mean, I think in the sense of the fact that I liked school, and at that age and given my family background, the only ways I understood that you could be a smart person that kept going in school was you were a lawyer or you were a doctor. Gotcha. And it was always the doctory, sciencey side that was interesting to me. And so, but I also really so I liked biology and I liked how those sorts of things worked. I can't really remember, and now I'm very sensitive about memory claims, but I don't really remember if I knew much about brains exactly, but I always found psychology to be interesting, from a relatively young age. I found, various things about how minds worked and how you could trick people's minds and, all that kind of stuff. Very interesting. So I don't think it had anything to do with the kind of therapeutic sense of psychiatry. I just was that's
sounds cool.
Yeah. Minds are working in science.
Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting aspect also of understanding the kinds of paths that are available to you, especially when, not connected to higher ed in this way, and what did that make, how that would shape, how that could potentially shape, not necessarily your interests, but at least the available paths of exploring your interest. So, yeah. Okay. So, all right. So tell us about, so in thinking about medical science or psychiatry or something like that, is this something that you began to pursue, let's say at, going into university? Did you go, from high school to college? How did things work?
Yeah, so I went to college. I went to a small liberal arts school in Arkansas. This was called Hendrix College. I think I wanted to get far away from the place where I grew up, but I was very drawn to going to one of these kind of small colleges, just not with the same small set of people I knew before. And it was a great place those kinds of colleges can be really special, kind of formative places.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I started out as a biology and psychology double major because I'm old enough that they were getting really interested, and I was part of some of the first classes that happened. But there was no neuroscience major. There was no that wasn't a thing.
Right.
So I was doing biology and I was doing psychology, and my senior year there was a cognitive neuroscience course, and it was awesome.
Yeah.
That was the first time I'm pretty sure it was the first time they'd offered it. That was all kind of starting in those ways at that time. But by my sophomore year, decided that I also wanted to do philosophy. So eventually the biology got dropped, and I ended up doing psychology and philosophy. But mostly because you couldn't have three majors, but.
So was that, so I know you've mentioned science so was this did you take a philosophy class in undergrad, or was there
Yeah.
What shifted to philosophy?
So that was my first real exposure to philosophy. And there was a sequence of classes all first year students had to take that involved some philosophy, but then and then going on to take another class or two. I really liked it. In part, I liked it because it was hard, so some of my interest in it was even prior to really seeing the intersection between philosophy and psychology. So I just enjoyed it. So I remember distinctly taking a course in early modern philosophy with someone who was, and of course they were very mind and metaphysics-y kinds of topics. But I was just I just loved it. So started taking more classes, and I was someone, and there were some pragmatic reasons in the background in that I had taken some college credits when I was in high school. And so my parents were they were like, well, you could probably just finish in 3 years. And I was like, there's no way I'm going to finish in 3 years, because I'm also getting a philosophy major. So it sort of start like that. And then once I saw the connection between philosophy and psychology for the kinds of questions I was interested in, that was sort of it for me.
Great. Okay. Right. So connecting with the philosophy, working in, So Hendrix College sounds like a really cool spot. These small liberal arts colleges, I think, can really do a great job of, shaping people how to, just furthering people's ability to think critically, open-mindedly. I'm glad to hear that you had a good experience.
There's actually, just as a small point of trivia, there are several philosophers who came out of there at the same time that I did. So Angela Potocznik, who is a dear friend of mine. Best buds in college. We met and we're best buds in college. So
fun.
And a few other people. Another friend of ours does ancient philosophy. It is at Wake Forest now. Another one does sort of early German philosophy, and last I checked was at a small school in Maryland. And several more went to grad school and got engaged in similar projects. So we were also there at a time when, for a small place, there was there were a lot of people really interested in doing philosophy, and we had, great professors that were really spending time with us, letting us do that. So
Great. All right. So I see. So eventually, tell us a little bit about how you came into, move forward to graduate work. So I know you mentioned that previously kind of coming up, there was, I imagine in university, this could have been, the ideas start to come, but prior, there is this not real understanding of doing, professional philosophy in a way. And so, how did you shift from then deciding, no medical science and psychiatry to then doing something like the graduate program that you did?
So when I graduated from college, I still thought I was going to go on in psychology. So I was all set my senior year to apply to cognitive neuroscience PhD programs.
Right.
So that's what I thought. I had made the shift away from med school, and then I was like, okay, so now I want to do this new thing called cognitive neuroscience. And as I was starting the application process, it was this, especially for those those kinds of programs. And at that time, which is more true in the sciences in general, you had to apply that you were going to two particular labs, right? You applied to programs, but you needed to say I want to work on visual perception with so-and-so. I want to do attention monitoring in this lab. And I was having this sort of crisis of it wasn't any one thing I wanted to do in that way. And that made me sort of realize I want to know about this research, and I want to write and think about it, but I don't actually want to do that research. Something about the way the programs are structured helped me to think about what I would actually be doing as a cognitive neuroscience grad student. And I realized I don't want to do that.
The doing is, it's a very different kind of day to day, and it's very narrow. The practice of it doesn't mean you can't read about other kinds of things, but it's I don't know. I had a very similar experience with working in behavioral neuroscience, and it was I don't know. Yeah. It's just interesting to hear that kind of, I love learning about the science and thinking about it. But it's, the idea of then saying, I want to work in this lab on this very specific problem or with this very specific brain region. And that's all, it feels like you're saying that's all I'm going to do. Feels constricted. So
it really, and it was discovering that the program I ended up going to that the philosophy, neuroscience, psychology program at WashU was a thing. I mean, this is also the early days of programs being on the internet. like a dinosaur.
They weren't in like a call, like a physical thing you could like, I don't know, call for or something, like a printed.
There were printed things, but and like some programs were getting better and better websites. I mean, I was part of that sort of lucky generation of like everyone was trying out online applications. So half my applications I did on a typewriter, the other half I got my fees waived because I tried their new online system for submitting my things. But so that was like 2003.
Wow.
And so finding out about the PNP program was very much like that's what I mean. Like so that was a program that actually involved taking courses in the sciences and doing that, but also taking courses in philosophy. Perfect. And so that made me then seek out programs like that were sort of, and of course imperfectly because my conception of the field was was limited. But finding philosophy of cognitive science oriented programs was what I went for.
Cool. All right. So so how was your time at the PNP program? I remember when I was first like looking at making the turn myself from behavioral neuroscience and psychology to in potentially philosophy of science. I heard great things about the PNP program. So what was it like there? What is the overall, I would say, this isn't something I necessarily asked, like the orientation of the training. Like, okay, it's one thing to say, okay, we do you take science courses and you take the philosophy, but like maybe we can go a little bit further here and understanding like what is kind of the way they approach doing philosophy of science or encourage folks to do it. I'd be more interested in that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's so many interesting features of that there and elsewhere, both that involve like what the actual curriculum structure is like, but there's so much also too that's about the kind of social and less formal bits of structure. So overall, while I was there on the kind of formal curriculum side, there was a real sort of debate happening in the program and in the department about what the PNP program was meant to look like, in the sense of should you have a full proper philosophy PhD with science added on, or should you have this, which means that it takes forever to get through that program because you have to take so many courses, or should it be a program where you take less philosophy and some psychology, some psych and neuro, because you're going to be doing them as a piece, and part of it had to do with thinking like, well, where is someone who gets this training going to get a job? So for a long time they thought, you have to have a full, proper philosophy PhD and then equip like what is effectively a master's in like psych and neuro, because you're going to get a job in a philosophy department ultimately. And so you need to be, like your philosophy credentials need to be unimpeachable in that sense. And that was the view when I started, and that was changing during my time there. But on the kind of more, it was a great place to do the sort of interaction between these fields. There's fantastic psychology and neuroscience at WashU, and the programs are physically close together. I think that matters. When I was trying to pick programs and then learning later, not all programs that like will let you do a cognitive science certificate or have some kind of connection. Sometimes they're on different campuses, right, in ways that can really affect whether the people are engaging and interacting with each other. And the philosophy and psych department and biology department at WashU are like literally, they're just one building across. They're like actually connected by a little walkway. You don't even have to go outside. And so several talks happen back and forth. There's sort of friendship, like the psych. I really liked that, most of the psychology and neuroscience faculty I took courses from were perfectly accustomed to having PNP students in their courses. So, we're interested in thinking about the ways that they designed assignments such that they made sense for us too at the graduate level, which was great. And I ended up actually working in a psychology lab during my time there for several years. I was sort of a proper lab member, which was great.
I think that's a really unique point. So I came from I also had some graduate training, and that where, we were certainly encouraged to do masters in the science, and in certain sciences, it was familiar, but there wasn't such the tight link where you had to do a lot of lifting of sometimes essentially convincing the science instructors like that you deserve to be in the graduate course. And like, this is the way in which you could not, I mean, they're usually fine with you enrolling, but it's like to be taken, like I found it sometimes struggling, like working with, just like some were much more like, oh yeah, of course, this is what we do. And then some were like, which department are you from again? Like, how is this a thing? And so hearing this kind of thing with like, I imagine instructors getting used to, okay, this is what it looks like for like philosophy students when they take the course, or this is how, I think that's really unique. I think that's a really great thing. And I wish it's something I would hope that, I don't know, maybe like these kind of philosophy of science programs would, if they're there and they're expecting their students to do it, they might have some like outreach and connection. Cause it's like, for example, like the folks that I'm now, like I've gone back and talked with them, and then they know of the department, but they've never actually spoken with the DGS or things like that. And that could be, just like a phone call or emails communicating, understanding, here's what we're encouraging our students to do. Things like that could be helpful. Yeah, absolutely. And I do think a lot of the legwork is on the part of, in these programs in ways that people don't always realize it, like it is on the part of graduate students, right? Sure.
And that's like, but it's a good thing and a bad thing. It's something I didn't appreciate about those programs. And I liked that for the areas I was going into, some people had already done that. And then there were several of my peers that were trying, one who was getting really interested in, primate related stuff, who was going to courses in anthropology, and they weren't yet part of that, group. And so at first this person was like, what are you what are your questions? Why, if you're from philosophy, I think the word that was that there were going to be sort of ethical questions, right? And which of course are still there, but it wasn't like, it was like, no, I'm genuinely interested in sort of cross species, cognition and things of that sort. So, it does take a lot of work, and it does pay forward for building a program. Yeah. Well, it's helpful, but as you said, also sort of, it does teach like, because this is something you have to go on to do for your own self, in your own research. And so like, this isn't going to be the first step to like working with other scientists and things like that. So it's like, it kind of teaches you in some ways, like that kind of, I don't know what you would call it. I don't know, some sort of it's like networking for the purpose of, it's like, it is networking in a very broad sense, but it's different. Yeah. Okay. So, all right. But so your program has been, so very supportive, encouraging. And, from what I've come to learn about, it is focused very intently on memory. So was this related to the psych lab that you ended up working in? It wasn't. So that was part of what I thought I was originally going to do. And then I stuck with it because it was such a rich and rewarding on many levels sort of experience to have. But so originally, and I think it's largely because it was the area where it looked like philosophy, one of the areas where philosophy and psychology were really working together very productively, was all of the things about theory of mind development that were sort of big topics where there was an incredible amount of interdisciplinary collaboration between philosophers and psychologists, like in the 90s and the early 2000s. I was super interested in that stuff. So that's what I thought I was going to be writing about, was sort of the development of the mind and these kinds of folk psychology concerns. So I was working with the primary developmental psychologist at WashU at the time, who was actually sort of most properly a psycholinguist. So she was really interested in children's development of written language, which is super fascinating. I think it takes a little while to connect it to some of the philosophical issues. But she was a fantastic mentor. And I think like psych departments are just very good at, or science in general is structured more to do a lot of training and networking. And so I really enjoyed those experiences and the kind of research project that we developed in there. And so I kept that going while I tried to figure out what my dissertation was actually, what I was actually going to work on. So, there was a stage where I knew that I just didn't feel like I had anything to contribute to the theory of mind debates. I was really interested in it, but I could never find, that's, I think, the hard thing as a grad student sometimes is like, I love this literature. This is really fascinating, but I don't have anything to say about it. Besides, it's cool, and that's cool. That's a really, so like, we don't talk about like the, I don't know what kind of house skill, but it's like, there's the one thing of like assessing, like, so some people are really good at jumping into like very worked out. I think I spoke about this with another guest recently. Like they're really good at jumping into like very worked out
like if you're jumping into like realism debates or something like that, and you're just jumping into things that have like, they've been around for a long time, and then you're having to come in and have something kind of, then to come in, excavate it, or like understand, and then have, come up with have something different to say in regard to this very well explored option. Or some people, I mean, maybe this actually isn't what's going on here, or stepping into something else that it's maybe a little more fertile and unique, and or like probably like has a little bit more ground clearing to do, perhaps. Yeah. I'm not sure if that's necessarily the case, because I don't want to say that like theory of mind things. It sounds like it was growing in the sense, so it was a little bit of A and B in terms of being a new field, like thinking about it this way. But maybe it's just what I want to, come back to that first thing of just understanding, like, one, when you're interested in something, but also two, when and if you, like, understanding if you do or do not have something to say, I think is a valuable tool. Yeah.
And I do think for the kind of work we require of philosophers, I mean, thinking about this with you now is making me realize how much this informs how I talk to our grad students. So I'm the DGS of our program.
Oh, wonderful.
And I really do think about like the kind of perspectives moving to dissertation stage. I'm someone who advocates really strongly for like we can't send a student off into that kind of writing stage without, like the clearing the perspectives until they have a result, like in the sense that, like, not in the sciencey sense, but like, knowing a literature super well, and being kind of all around it is wonderful. And those are skills obviously you have to have. But I think there's a kind of confidence and clarity that you get once you've got something figured out, right? You're like, no,
I think generally, and I've seen things, I mean, this comes probably beyond even like philosophy, but like literature or things that were like the idea or the concept is almost like, it can be like very like 55% of, I don't want to say it's the majority of the work, but it's like if you have a very novel claim or something, or I mean, just comparing it with you, like, it's not just like, okay, the topic is interesting and you can send them off to like understand it, because they might go off and understand it for a couple of years and realize, I don't know what to, where's the contribution, or like, what do you, and it's the contribution. It's not, I mean, it's not that learning about these things is not like futile in itself, and it could direct things in terms of teaching, or maybe the way it shapes your other research. But like in terms of adding a brick adding things to the body of work, like, you're right. It's probably good to sort of evaluate perspectives, is that you at least have to have something that you're like, okay, I could see how at least maybe, it depends how they're going to eventually get there, but they have to show that they've got kind of already have an end in mind, that this appears to be something that is worth saying in this area. That's really good evaluation.
And it can be like and it can be a small portion of what they'll go on to say. But I think, having that thing anchors you also helps I mean, for any project, I still feel this way sometimes when writing papers, but like, especially when writing a dissertation, it's hard to know what is and isn't relevant, right? If you follow the things you're interested in, you can end up in some wild places. And so, when you're writing a dissertation, you can't just keep doing that. So you have to know, like, what's relevant for what I'm interested in and not. And if you've got some kind of like, well, I know that I think, X is the right move here, then that can tell you what to bring in or what not to bring in or where to go next. And so I think that really is a critical component. And so despite my interest in those things, I think retrospectively, I couldn't have described it that way at the time. I just didn't have that. And so I was really spinning my wheels in that kind of late coursework, early transition stage about what it was I was going to do.
So how did you switch? So, okay. So but you're taking a number of courses and things. So how did the, moving toward, okay. So maybe did you end up writing the dissertation related to theory of mind?
I ended up writing on memory.
Okay. So how did that shift happen?
Yeah. So I had gotten myself to a point that I thought I was going to write about personal and subpersonal levels of explanation in psychology.
Okay.
And so, which was sort of related to the theory of mind stuff. But I also, part of what wasn't working for me, I actually ended up switching advisors at that point. So, so I had been working with someone, and then that relationship wasn't working very well for that either. And so that was when Carl Craver became my advisor. And Carl, didn't really care, but I mean, he was enthusiastically supporting helping me, but the personal subpersonal explanation was that's not his, it's not an issue that he's got, sort of
major stake in.
He's got no dog in that fight or horse in that race or whatever. And he could tell that I was spinning my wheels, and he very helpfully, I think, both for that moment and for me, like professionally, said like, okay, well, so what about, he's like, I was just reading something the other day about the idea of a memory trace. And he was like, is a memory trace personal or subpersonal? Why don't you just try to go answer that question? And I was like, okay, I'll go do that. And then, I mean, it wasn't like literally the next day, but then he left and was in Germany for like 6 months, or he was on some kind of extended leave around the time that I was going to do that. And one of the first times we met, like now I don't remember whether it was like over what would have been like Skype in those days, or if it was when he got back. And he was like, how are things going? And I was like, well, sort of good news, bad news, because we were thinking that might be the like first chapter. Like, let's just try this stuff out. And I was like, good news, bad news. Like bad news, because he was gone long enough, I said I was going to try to have a draft of like all the major chapters. And so I was like, well, good news, bad news, I don't have the draft of all the chapters. But the good news is the first chapter is like 95 pages long. And he was like, okay, so it sounds like what you have is a different dissertation. You're actually trying to write a dissertation about memory instead. And I was like, is that what I'm doing?
Yep.
And so that's sort of how it got started.
Fantastic. Yeah. All right. Well, tell us, okay, so why don't you, so what, maybe could you share with maybe some of your, sort of your major, what you ended up realizing what you had to say about memory traces or memory in general. What did he end up saying in the dissertation? Or maybe like one or two of the main points?
Yeah. So I ended up saying, at this point, I'll just say as kind of background, there was no philosophy of memory at this time. There were a couple of other people starting to do, there were a few things that had been written by kind of senior people on this topic, but not very much. And there were a few young people starting to write, but like there were literally, like a handful at most of things on the topic. And a kind of standard default background view in memory is this thing called the causal theory of memory, which is based on a very intuitive idea that like, if you remember, for it to be right that you say you remember your, I'm going to say 6th birthday, because today is my son's 6th birthday, right? If you remember that later, then, if, he got a green bike this morning. So like if you,
I bet he's excited.
It's epic, as he would say.
That's
if you remember that later, then there has to be some way in which your current mental state is caused by that previous fact, right? Like if you genuinely remember it versus just like, inferring it from general knowledge about the world. There has to be some way in which something that happened to you when you got the bike is now operative in you thinking about it later. That's the sort of, in a very philosopher's term way of thinking about what the causal theory of memory is. And I was really interested in, and that view is kind of the default and dominant view to the extent there was anyone talking about memory. And, I took a lot of classes in psychology, and the lesson from psychology is that memory is a hot mess, right? Like, you think you're remembering when you're not, and all this stuff is happening. And so psychologists think, and neuroscientists were in a phase of thinking of memory as sort of wildly constructive. And so my dissertation was about like, how do you put those two things together? And what I really thought was like, I think memory is less wildly constructive than psychologists think sometimes. But I do think that you are retaining things from the past in the way the causal theory suggests, but that it can be influenced by lots of other things that happen to you in various ways. So I was taking some of the famous memory error experiments and showing how they required a kind of hybrid view.
Very nice. So, that's wonderful. And yeah, I have experience for taking this. My only exposure to real direct memory was either a psychology of memory course, which was focusing on these like error experiments and just like more like behavioral experiments from the past, phenomena, exploring like what it is. But I did remember we had to learn like memory tricks in order to resolve the memory exam. So, because the exam, this was really interesting. The exam was like, it would be 30 short answer questions, where some of the so it was a long exam where you had to maybe even reproduce graphs from memory. And so we had to use the memory techniques. Again, this was, this isn't looking into the philosophy of memory. It was just more like, how could you explore and utilize? So it was more just like psychological, like studies in terms of like, how could you improve memory? How could you use it for maintaining these things? So like, I remember like studying in certain like locations, switching up the locations, studying for, breaking up the study, all using all the things that you were, all of these I don't want to say behavioral studies, but like, things like that. It was, and well, I don't want to say they worked, causally, I don't know, but it did fine. I was impressed. I was like, wow, I never thought I could remember this much. But it had me thinking a lot about, just thinking, I think further related to that question of how much is memory constructive and in what ways, I think is like kind of the big question, it seems like, or one of the big empirical questions. And then in some ways like philosophical questions. But so up until this point, like what could you say a little bit about, and maybe this has changed, like the relationship between philosophers and then like the science and, psychologists and neuroscientists as it relates to just like in their connection with one another, like, because I wasn't familiar with the literature on folks just writing about, from a philosophy of mind position. How did it maybe prior not necessarily interface as much with the science?
I think it's a great question. I mean, it's interesting to me sociologically that this is the case. I mean, I think especially because philosophy and like psychology and neuroscience have been, there's so much work in conferences and organizational structures at that intersection. And it's somewhat surprising how little intersection there was on memory, given how much there is on everything else. Like both you think about like how much philosophy of perception there is as a field, and then that there's just tons of work of people doing things on forms of seeing and attending and other sensory processes and their relationships to philosophy. Like those fields are all like really nicely, they're a nice interdisciplinary, rich set, like lots of people working there. And so like, why memory where there is this enormous, I mean, like if you were to base your philosophy of cognitive science on where the most cognitive science is happening, it'd be really strange for you to leave memory out.
Right.
Memory was for a really long time, there weren't a lot of people doing that from the philosophy side. I mean, I think in some sense, because it was so big, because they didn't grow up to like, it is a very overwhelming kind of space to get in. There's kind of no way to get up to speed on the science of memory. It is, it's massive.
That's like a little, sometimes I've found that issue where I might be very interested in a particular, because especially if you're into, cognitive science or something like that, and then you get into it and you're like, this is going to take a long time to learn this, like to really well, like I was interested in like connectomics and like other kinds of like modeling factors. And I realized this is going to take like a couple of years maybe to like really say something. Like it really can structure and dictate like what you decide to go into. So I could see maybe that being one explanation of something like that. Or, I mean, I'm sure there's other, sociologically, other kinds of disciplinary things, but like, right, memory is so vast and so big and, I don't know. Anyway. Okay. So, but now it sounds like things are connecting more so. A little.
Very much so. So, I mean, there were some people, some of the early work, so John Sutton, who was at Macquarie for a long time, he wrote a book about memory traces in the late 90s. Christoph Hurl, along with the psychologist Teresa McCormick, they wrote a book about memory and time, like in the early 2000s. I think of both of those things now as these like kind of like empirically informed, trying to put this stuff together. But that, like, there was no literature on on either of the things that those folks were doing, and it wasn't until there were a couple of us who were all finishing and working on memory at the same time. So Philippe de Brigard and me and Kirk and McCallion were all sort of around the same time starting to work on these things. And I think in those early days there was. It was sort of hard to know. I mean, it has grown very rapidly. It went from like, there's like literally two other people writing on this broad range of topics in philosophy to like, oh, now there are just tons and tons. And so there was some stuff in epistemology and in stuff about personal identity on memory. So Sven Bernecker wrote a couple books about memory. But a lot of people were really thinking about, kind of thinking about the way memory fits into standard problems. Like, if you're worried about theories of knowledge, not all your knowledge is occurring to you right now. So you got to put some of it in memory. So memory better work in a certain way. Or, personal identity. One view says it's about, retaining past iterations of yourself or being able to cast yourself backwards. And so memory is implicated a lot. So people would talk about it in those fields in terms of its implications, but no one was like, well, what is memory and what's interesting about memory itself? And that's really, I think, where the field has sort of taken off is, asking those questions for its own sake in a way that's very science informed. So I think the virtue of it being a newer and more newly developing area is that it's been kind of science or I'd say at least naturalistically situated.
That's fair.
Yeah. While it's been kind of exploding.
Very, very cool. Very cool. Okay. All right. So focus. Okay. So, well, I'm happy to hear it. It's encouraging to hear a successful turn of, it's just interesting to me also the way in which folks, are shifting gears early on. You hear, the way in which, we come to find the thing that's like really motivating and really interesting to us, and or again, where we might have a success at making some really good contributions. I think that's really great. So, so I mean, I can see like you have a very impressive resume, lots of publications, lots of different positions. So tell us a little bit about, we were also doing some biographical things. So what, after graduate school, how did you then, approach professionally? What did you move on to do?
Yeah. So my first job out of grad school was, I was very fortunate to get a tenure track job in my first year on the job market.
Very nice.
I was in grad school for a long time. So for people who I was in grad school for 8 years. So which happens in a program where you take courses for a long time and then switch dissertation topics. But I think in some sense, I say this now from the perspective of being a DGS, that for philosophy especially, it takes a long time for your ideas to mature and for you to grow a sense of a field. And so as programs get their funding cut more and more and can only offer their grad students so much support, I think it really does hurt philosophy, because I think I was advantaged in going on the job market by the fact that I'd had that long to think about things. So it was much easier to talk to people about how my work connected to theirs and how it connected to other areas, because I just had more time. And so I do think that was an advantage that I had. And memory was kind of new and exciting. So I could tell people a lot of stuff they didn't know and then connect it to stuff they did. So I felt like that really helped me out. So I got a tenure track job at the University of Texas, El Paso. I was very excited to move to the bright, sunny desert.
That's wonderful. Great. So had the experience at El Paso, but then I noticed, we kind of started the interview with this sort of, the experience with your family and kind of them sort of convincing you, or I told you so, about a potentially, the opportunity to kind of return home. So how did that, or I don't want to say return home, but just like return to like a, kind of a nearby region of sorts after being, in Missouri, or say, in other places where, like, again, you never really expect as an academic necessarily to go back to like the origin spot.
Yeah. And I wasn't, so I only ended up spending a year in El Paso, and that was in part, there were a lot of factors. And again, there's like so much like luck and privilege and even being able to frame it in this way. But, there were lots of things I loved about that job and would have been happy to stay longer, but there weren't a lot of senior colleagues in the department and there wasn't a lot of mentorship. So I did, I felt a little at sea about how I was going to grow those aspects of things. It was also a university that was really changing and growing in some exciting ways. But that meant that there were a lot of potential demands on junior faculty to participate in these kind of university level initiatives in ways that made finally getting time to sit down and write your papers alongside teaching and all these other things quite demanding. And so, the thought that maybe in a few years I'll be aiming to go someplace else was a thought that I had not terribly long after getting there, even though I think I would have been happy there for a long time. And then a job came at the University of Kansas and, in my area. And I thought I'm not going to.
Why not take it? Yeah.
But I'm going to apply for that job because they have a philosopher of mind. They're not going to, so as soon as they find somebody and, the person that they'd had for 40 years, that my my predecessor was retired. He'd been there for 40 years. I was like, this is literally a once in every 40 years shot at this sort of thing. So, which was, sort of how it was at the time. So I threw my hat in the ring for that and nothing else. And then left out. So I moved after a year to KU, and I've been here ever since. So
great. Wonderful. Well, great. Well, thank you. So I have a question. So you've studied memory a lot. What might be perhaps one or two things that you found in your research to be the most surprising things that you found out about memory? Like things that would be, for I guess I would say more for like individuals who maybe aren't not necessarily. I mean, you could, if you want to share something that's more in a philosophy based finding, but also just maybe in general, like that might just be experience for folks who are not might not be within our field, so to speak, and just thinking what is kind of surprising that from your work in thinking about memory traces or engrams as they've been referred to, is that like a neuroscience, more specifically like a neuroscience term, essentially?
Way of, it's like the scientized, mechanized term
version of a trace.
Yeah,
exactly.
Okay. I mean, I think my work and like my interest is sort of captivated by results on two ends, some of which we were talking about earlier. One is the sort of like just how malleable and constructive memory can be. So I think to the everyday person, I think it's still, it's hard for me now in the in the grips of all of that research to appreciate how many people don't have that view of memory. But our memories are they're easily distorted and manipulated in ways that it can feel to you like, no, that's definitely the person that I saw. And it isn't, or it is the person that you saw, but not in the context in which you think you saw them. And those things have huge implications, not just for like our interpersonal relationships and the way we testify to each other about stuff, but, in social and political and criminal and legal contexts, as a lot of psychologists and neuroscientists have done work on, right? Those forms of manipulability and distortion are so those results are really striking to me, sort of how they're not easy in some respects, but they're easy in others. That we know very well what to do if we want you to misremember something. And then the other side of things, that like the ways in which our memories are good, is also really interesting to me. So the stuff you were saying about, like learning these memory techniques, right? I'm also simultaneously fascinated by people who train for these memory championships and memorize 70,000 digits of pi, or they can do all of these just incredible memory feats. Like our memories,
or like trivia communities or whatever, like the quiz communities, stuff like that. Yeah.
Exactly. It can do that. And like there are memories I have from childhood. Like some of them are, of course, distorted, or I've learned over time that, you see the photo album and you're like, oh, wow, that's funny. I, mix these things together. Right. But there are also things that we can hold distinctly and we can hold for a long time. And so thinking about what's true about memory such that all of that is true at the same time is kind of...
That's interesting. Yeah.
That's sort of like what gets me out of bed in the morning, so to speak.
Wonderful. I also in a personal interest. Is there like an ethics of memory division or something in terms of, so like for me, like I've just personally been thinking about questions like what is the maybe not the purpose of memory, but in what ways, to what do we maybe owe to our memories? What do we owe in terms of a responsibility for preserving memories, or preserving memories in the way, like, what do we owe to preserving the truthfulness of memories? Or like, I don't know, just especially as like you get older and then maybe you realize like certain memories are fading, or I don't even know if you want to say fading, but like, I'm like, should I be like writing this down? Like, I mean, this is a very, kind of folk consideration, but as a philosopher or someone who studies this, I'm like, do I have like, what are these kind of responsibilities to considering, and not just like for historical purposes of this, but like just for personal, just for like one's individual sense of like, traveling through the world. Like,
Yeah. I mean, I think these are huge and important questions. To my knowledge, there are not many people working on the ethics of memory per se, at least not in the philosophy of memory community. There are a few things and a few pieces. Julia Driver has a lovely piece that I like about the harms involved in forgetting someone. that has always been a sort of inspiration for me. Allison Rayheld, who's if I'm saying her, I don't even know if I'm saying her name correctly. She's at Southern Illinois, Edwardsville, she has a really nice ethics of memory piece that I take to be like, only from a few years ago, but where she's really kind of grappling with the question about like, if memory is reconstructive in all these ways, how should we think about a lot of ethical issues around that? And it strikes me as like, yeah, that could like kick off an entire field of concerns. I don't know that it has yet, but I hope that it does. But because I think a lot of these things are important. And the closest philosophers of memory have really gotten to that so far is in starting to think more about the nature of forgetting. And like, so one thing you might think is like, you can't hold someone responsible for remembering because you're like sort of not in charge of it in the right kind of way. But there is a lot of motivated and intentional forgetting, actually. And so some people have been talking about those things more and kind of complicating that picture in ways that I think are going to be helpful for that conversation. But I'm always a big, like, more people doing this kind of stuff. You know, everybody join Philosophy of Memory. So you should think about this or encourage other people to. It'd be great to see it happen.
Oh, yeah. No, well, I mean, I've always held that. I've never thought of it as, I mean, you're convincing me slightly to like look into this. My field is more in philosophy of like psychiatry and things. But like, for example, like so there's some memory issues in PTSD, like things like flashbacks and like the way in which like trauma is remembered. And there's some fascinating sort of like examples whereby people will remember, they'll have some sort of memory of a particular trauma, and then this is an example where they'll then be given some kind of new information, and then they'll remember the trauma very differently. So it's like, and I'm sure it's like updated, but what I mean is like, or maybe it's more just like I don't know if they'll remember the trauma differently, but their perception of the event or the relationship or something will change. Just a very quick example is like someone who presents for PTSD for bereavement, like a spouse has passed away of several years, and they having this sort of experience about this, and then later on they it come to find out that the spouse was unfaithful. There's infidelity involved, and then all of a sudden, what do you mean? I like there's all of a sudden this like confabulation or like complete change of like, I don't remember fondly this person, because of the new information regarding the infidelity. That's like a very unique case. It's just one that happened to be shared as an anecdote from someone I spoke with. But I found it very fascinating to consider. Yeah. Like in what ways is this then those kinds of things influencing? In what ways, I suppose, are these like maybe maladaptive things or maladaptive responses like trauma or things influencing memory and stuff like that?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that relates to what I think is another big and it is studied empirically, but in a lot of different ways and not really taken up by philosophers much yet, which is the sort of relation between emotion and affect in memory. So how you think about this, there's so much to say there. Things have been said, but there's so much more to be said on all of those.
Fair enough. Well, we only have a little bit of time. Why don't you tell us about, what are your current projects, current research, anything you'd like to share about kind of what you're up to right now?
Yeah, so I've been thinking a lot about, someone who came from the cognitive side of things. I've been spending a lot of my time recently in the weeds of neurobiology. So as someone who was first interested in like false memory experiments and cognitive psychology, I got really interested when via techniques like optogenetics and chemogenetics, neurobiologists started making what looked like false memory paradigms in mice. And so I've been focusing a lot on how that research has kind of reinvigorated work around the notion of an engram, this idea that you could have a kind of detectable, identifiable memory mechanism for a particular memory. And so that idea is sort of back alive and central to a lot of stuff that's happening in neurobiology. So a lot of my work recently has been thinking about that concept, how it's changed over time, how it really relates to the cognitive work. So I've been working on a number of pieces in that regard. And in the background, I am working on somewhat perpetually at this point, on a book that has to do with the notion of a memory trace, and sort of giving a kind of theory of what that actually is that makes sense of what contemporary neurobiology is doing. That's the that's the aim.
Fantastic. All right. Well, that's well, we're looking forward to that and understanding this. So, and it sounds like, I should mention, so you mentioned you are the DGS at at Kansas, where you do have MA and PhD programs in philosophy. Is that right?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Okay. Well, I'm always interested and familiar with and encouraging other. Is that something where you're taking applicants at this time, or things like that?
Yeah. So January 5th is our application deadline. And we have, I think we have a really positive and good grad community. So anyone who listens to this should definitely think about putting us on their list. So
wonderful. Okay, well, why don't we conclude with the last question? What do you take to be the greatest challenge facing philosophy of science today?
Yeah, I was trying to think of an answer to that before I realized that I was off by an hour.
Fair enough.
I was like, there went the 20 minutes. I was going to try to
come up with something. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, one thing I think is true, which I think is a virtue it's a virtue and then a problem for philosophy of science, is that, I support and like and am a product of the idea that philosophy of science now is more like the philosophy of the sciences, right? So there's not a kind of like, here's the issue of explanation as it applies everywhere. Here's the issue of realism as it applies everywhere. We're sort of realizing that you should take particular sciences or forms of scientific inquiry on their own merits and look at them individually, which shows that they're different, also allows time to give attention to other sciences that don't always get that attention, like psychiatry or archaeology or, like so many interesting areas of study. And so I think at least one of the great challenges is like keeping the philosophy of science together while all of that happens, right? So in the same way that, so like making sure that there's still spaces and issues and connections that are kind of cross field disciplinary as those things happen. I think that, if not the greatest challenge, a very important
It's a big one. It's a big one. Yeah. I would interpret this as like the hyper specialization. But the way you put it brings to me also then questions of like, so what is, so what is our goal of sort of keeping things what are some of the consequences if we're not unable to keep things together, or what are some of the benefits of keeping this together? Like, especially if we're, more interested in like, developing these little pockets of, good philosophical questions, not necessarily in service of the science, but in service of broader, all these other kind of rules. Is there something, it's not necessarily, to bring back to add to the, understanding of the philosophy of science, so what are some good reasons why we would?
So, I mean, on that hyper specialization point, I think in the same way that part of what philosophy of science is doing for science now is that because it got so hyper specialized, there are people working in memory research, who don't know that there's other people doing that. There's some neurobiologists and some cognitive psychologists that I take to be speaking to really similar things. And they have no idea the others, there's just no incentive or even, it's not clear what it would take for them to even much know about or understand each other's work. So I take some of the work that we philosophers are doing to be really important in that sense of providing a framework to put that stuff together. And I worry that we're going to follow suit, and someday it's going to be like, well, the philosophers of archaeology are doing this really interesting thing, and the people thinking about the nature of chemistry, are doing this other interesting thing, and we're not going to be able to kind of put those into conversation with each other anymore. Or so that kind of broader perspective, we could lose something by not thinking about, you start to take for granted what focuses only in your area.
Definitely. That fair enough. No, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. All right. Well, Sarah, Dr. Robbins, I really appreciate you taking the time. I had a lot of fun. Thank you again. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. And I think this was really nice.
This was it was very lovely. I appreciate the invitation and the service of doing this kind of a podcast. I think this is a really, it's a great service to the profession. So thanks for doing it.
I appreciate that. Well, best of luck. Enjoy the remainder of your Friday, and we'll be in touch soon. Are you happening to go to the PSA by chance?
I am.
Okay.
There'll be a memory symposium. I'll be a part of.
I'm planning to
flirt with pluralism.
What's that?
I'm going to flirt with pluralism about.
Oh, wonderful! Oh, fun. Okay. Well, enjoy the rest of your Friday. I'll be sure to say hello at the PSA if I can make it to the memory workshop. So
that sounds great.
Thanks. Take care.